Broadcasting from Detroit's Cass Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham. This hour, we'll explore the alternative press. Not just the news you can get outside of mainstream sources, but Detroit's own alternative press, founded by two passionate creatives. Ken and Ann Mikolowski saw power in allowing people to speak their truths. A new book, Dispatches from the Avant-Garage, takes us through the history of the periodical. Then, a Detroit native chronicles her journey from adolescence to adulthood and how the city of Detroit around her rapidly changed too. Maureen Eichen tells us more about the novel and how she navigated through girlhood. But first, when political tensions are high, artists and creatives use their work to weigh in. In the 1960s, two Detroit artists, a poet and a painter, built a place for that work to live and to be shared across the country and across the world. Ann and Ken Mikolowski came together in 1969, taught themselves how to use a printing press, and launched the alternative press in the Cass Corridor. For 30 years, the periodical published writings and poetry from their contemporaries. Rebecca Kosick is recognizing those efforts. Kosick is an associate professor of comparative poetry and poetics at the University of Bristol. In her new book, Dispatch from the Avant-Garage, she details the story of the Mikolowskis and their efforts publishing the alternative press. Rebecca, welcome to the Metro.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yes, happy to have you here. This is actually something that's close to heart right here at WDET. So before we get going, I want to get some clarification on the title of your book, Avant-Garage. How did you come up with that?
Well, actually, it came from a postcard that Ken Mikolowski published through the alternative press that was one of his poems. And it was just a picture of a garage door, and on it, it said the Avant-Garage. But it's such a great postcard, first for a press from the city of Detroit, because it plays on, the city's history with the automobile industry and the Motor City. And so when I was going to name the book, I wanted to draw inspiration from Ken's own writing and also pay homage to the city of Detroit. So the Avant-Garage seemed like a great play on words because they're doing this amazing avant-garde work in the center of the automobile industry in the 1960s.
Yes. And as well, we can also see it as a play on, the garage rock scene in the city as well during that time. It was a lot happening.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. So, Rebecca, let's start with a brief overview of how the alternative press began. Ken and Ann Mikolowski were deeply ingrained with the art scene in Detroit's Cass Corridor. And before we get into the press itself, what was going on at that time that set the stage for the alternative press's eventual founding?
Yeah, so Ann and Ken Mikolowski were both affiliates of the Detroit Artists Workshop, which predated the alternative press. And the press actually belonged to the Detroit Artists Workshop. I did an interview with John Sinclair, another Detroiter who was involved with the alternative press in its early days and throughout. And he talked about how the Detroit Artists Workshop had acquired this letterpress printer, but they never really kind of got off the ground with it. They preferred to use other technologies like the mimeograph machine. And so they sold the press to the Mikolowskis, who moved it into their basement, which is an enormous effort because the letterpress, it weighs 1,000 pounds, and all of the lead type and everything that comes with it is enormously heavy. But they moved it into their basement on Avery Street, and they started printing, taught themselves, and really they were off and running from there.
Wow. So Ann Mikolowski was a gifted painter. What influenced her to create a publishing company?
I think her and Ken found that their two practices as a painter and a poet met with the alternative press in a kind of wonderful way because they were able to do work that was both visual and textual and poetic in nature and kind of combine their talents. And Ken talks about how, he did his work as a poet, she did her work as a painter, and all of that continued. But the thing that brought their work together was the alternative press, which was really the perfect combination of their talents and their partnership as artists and creatives in the city.
So, Rebecca, Ken at one point worked at the Wayne Review under Pulitzer Prize winning poet W.D. Snodgrass. What influence did that experience have on him?
Yeah, Ken talks a lot about W.D. Snodgrass as an incredibly influential figure in his life, but sometimes in surprising ways. He talks about how initially he had been, I think I quote him in the book as saying he was a good little Snodgrassian because he really followed Snodgrass's lead and he kind of, took along all of the sort of formal preferences that Snodgrass brought into his teaching, and Ken was incorporating that into his writing at the time. But he tells this sort of origin story that they differed in the Wayne Review over some of the kind of aesthetics that Ken wanted to bring out as the editor, and Ken wanted to publish other local Detroit poets that he was engaged with. He wanted to publish and did publish people like Faye Kignosway, Dudley Randall, Andre Kudrescu. And so they started to just disagree then. And, Ken talks about how one of the things that you've got to do as a student is eventually sort of overthrow your teachers and turn in your own direction. And that's what he did. And Ken started doing, a really different style of poetry that finds a perfect home in the alternative press. He's known for, very short form, funny, often ironic, and politically engaged poetry that, fits perfectly on a postcard or a bumper sticker. So I think that he still respected Snodgrass, but they obviously parted ways in terms of the kind of aesthetic tendencies that they each wanted to pursue. But Ken, he had a long career, and Snodgrass is definitely an influential part of that.
So, speaking of them stepping out and doing their own thing, because the alternative press truly is them stepping out and doing their own thing, could you say a little bit more about what the alternative press's published work looked like? How did Anne and Ken's work come together visually?
Yeah, so the alternative press published overwhelmingly in these sorts of small ephemeral formats, mainly the postcard, but they also published with bookmarks, bumper stickers, and broadsides, which are like a single sheet of paper that is just printed on one side. In the early days, so around 1969, when they were just getting it off the ground, they published just poetry, so text only. But they started adding visual designs to it a little bit later. Ken has this joke about how, he would stand outside the Detroit Institute of Arts and try to give away free poems to people, but they would recoil in horror from the prospect of poetry. But he says
Wow.
that once they started including images, they were able to, sell things a little bit more. And they still only charge $10 a year, so we're not talking about a huge operation here, a capitalist operation or anything. But he and Anne then combined images and text on the postcards and broadsides and bookmarks that they did. And they do it often in really clever ways where there's a great dialogue between the image that they've included and what the poem is about. The first one that they ever included images on was a poem by Jerome Rothenberg that was also a kind of translation and reworking of Native American poetry that he was studying at the time, Rothenberg.
Yeah.
And it's called Crazy Dog Events, and it describes these different sort of actions that the person who's reading it can put into, the world or sort of perform. And Anne Mikolowski, carved a linoleum block that had a kind of dog imprint that they used as a border around it. So there was often this kind of intermedia dialogue going on between the visual and the verbal in their publications.
And if we could, for just, stick right here for a moment, talk about the accessibility of that, because you have postcards and bookmarks. These are things that people can easily just have in their hands and take with them wherever they are. So talk about that aspect of accessibility.
Exactly. That's one of the things I love so much about the alternative press's ethos. I think for them, there really was no separation between art and life. And, some artists might sort of treat art as something that needs to be separated from life. You kind of go into a refuge and you create art over there. And, that's something that we can respect in its own way. But the way that the alternative press operated was really to just constantly dissolve that line between, poetry is something that some people think of as esoteric and, the world. So putting a poem on a bumper sticker, for instance, you're driving down the highway and all the people that are around you are reading poetry, even if they don't know it.
Exactly.
And so it just comes into their lives, into their world. Same with postcards too, because they're open face. If they travel through the mail carrier is reading it, someone pins it up on their refrigerator, and your friends come by and they see it. So even people that wouldn't necessarily be inclined to go to a poetry reading or to buy a volume of poetry to read are encountering poetry because all of the publications that the alternative press put out really lived in the world with us and with their readers. And that's one of the things that I think is most remarkable about the work that they did.
You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Tia Graham. My guest is Rebecca Kosick. She is an associate professor of comparative poetry and poetics at the University of Bristol. We are discussing her book, Dispatches from the Avant Garage, in which she documents the work of the Detroit-based publication, The Alternative Press. Now, the Rebellion of 1967, as we all know, had a dramatic impact on the city of Detroit. It can still be felt today. How did the Mikolowskis navigate that time?
Yeah, so they were living in the Jeffries housing projects at the time, and Ken remembers that the firefighters refused to put out the fire when it came to their neighborhood.
Mm.
So they were obviously really marked by that experience and going through the rebellion and seeing the ways that the state abandoned its duty of care for Detroit. Later on, the people who had been living in their house that they eventually bought on Avery Street moved to California along with the white flight that was occurring at the time. And these owners decided that they were never coming back to Detroit. And so Anne and Ken Mikolowski were able to buy this quite large house in the Cass Corridor at a very, very reduced price. And it had enough space there that they were able to set up the printing press in their basement. So the physical sort of possibilities that made the press, something that was able to get off the ground are very interrelated with the events of the late 1960s in Detroit. And Ken and Ann, as committed Detroiters, wanted to stay in the city and continue producing art there. They grew up there and they were committed to staying and building the alternative press there. And the city of Detroit and the work that they did are incredibly interlinked.
Thinking about just, of course, everything you just said, but Ken and Anne being in a space where we did see white flight happening
Mm-hmm.
in mass, but they stayed, and that's something that's unique when we think about just once again the city of Detroit and who claims ownership of it.
Yeah, that's right. I think that it's something that for them, they never really considered leaving at that point. Ken even has a poem, it's called Go, that's about that time. And he talks about how, leaving Detroit wasn't even an option for everyone. So it's something that I think really didn't even register for them as something that they would want to do or that they were necessarily able to do, even if they had wanted to. But they were so tied in with their community of artists and Detroiters down in the Cass Corridor that it wasn't, I don't think, something that was a plan for them to leave the city. Instead, they wanted to stay in the city and continue building, as they had been building already, this community of artists and painters and writers and poets who would continue to explore and build their own DIY creative operations there.
Rebecca, we will get into specific poets shortly, but as brief as you can, describe the editorial approach of the alternative press.
So most of the time it was Ken that did the correspondence. They didn't necessarily seek out a lot of poets. A lot of it traveled by word of mouth.
Mm.
So mainly people approached them with ideas, and then the Mikolowskis had to sort of direct them toward very brief poems because letterpress printing is enormously time consuming. To set by hand each individual lead letter for something like a postcard, that could take 4 hours to just print a postcard.
Oh,
One,
wow.
one printing, not even to mention the images that you would add a second printing onto that. And so, in the archives at the University of Michigan that I was researching for the book, you would see people sending like novels or these long pieces. And that was definitely out of the question because, it really just wasn't amenable to the constraints of letterpress. And then Anne did a lot of the typesetting, although they both kind of did it together. And obviously, she did all of the artwork. Most of the time with the poets, it was Ken that was kind of guiding and deciding what things would come in. And they worked really collaboratively with everyone who contributed, both poets and artists, to their publications. So there was a lot of dialogue and a lot of back and forth. And you can see in the correspondence that's held in the archive that poets will sort of pitch an idea, and then Ken writes back, and then they write back, and over the course of multiple letters, the ultimate sort of publication will come into being. But it was very collaborative, very DIY, and not it wasn't a sort of formalized operation with kind of institutional practices or something like that.
Rebecca, we're going to get back into our conversation after a quick break. I do want our listeners to know that you've got a little construction going on your end, and that is some
We
of
do.
the
I apologize.
rumbling. Yeah, no worries at all. It's that time of year. Construction cones are everywhere. But coming up, we are going to discuss the impact the Mikolowskis and the alternative press had on the literary works that followed. You all stay right there. We'll be right back. This is The Metro. This is The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Tia Graham. We are talking about the Alternative Press, which was a counterculture periodical founded in Detroit's Cass Corridor that published poems and writings from the 1960s through the early 2000s. My guest is Rebecca Kosick. She is an associate professor of comparative poetry and poetics at the University of Bristol. We are discussing her book, Dispatches from the Avant Garage, in which she documents the alternative press's work. Now, Rebecca, rejoining this conversation, the alternative press was founded in 1969. That was obviously a very political time for the city and the country. There was the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the women's liberation movement. How was the editorial framing of the publication shaped by this time?
Yeah, I mean, you can really see the Times register in the alternative press's publications. And it goes all the way through from their sort of founding in the 1960s through the 1980s and into the 1990s when they finally end. And, early on, you see that many of the movements that are active in Detroit are also part of the community that the Mikolowskis are running in, and they feed into the publications that they're putting out at the time. So, for instance, one of their earliest publications was a poem that's also called The Alternative Press and dedicated to the alternative press by John Sinclair when he was incarcerated in Marquette at the time. So he had been arrested for possession of a small amount of marijuana, but was also being targeted by the FBI and local police at the time for his activism. He had founded the White Panthers, which was a group of activists and leftists in Detroit who were white but wanted to support the activities of the Black Panthers and wanted to support the cause of Black liberation. And he was very heavily targeted by police at the time. But he was one of the collaborators of the Mikolowskis. And while he was imprisoned, he sent them loads of poetry and they published it. And he talks about how important alternative publishing is to being able to maintain these activities and to build a network and a political response to the repression that he saw happening at the time and that obviously many other people saw happening at the time. And so when they sent that out, they're getting lots of letters back from people all over the country who are then also wanting to be in dialogue with Sinclair and the alternative press. And you see that the press grows as the politics around it also grow. And there's a lot of interrelation between what's happening in the wider culture and what's being published by the alternative press.
Rebecca, I mean, Sinclair was famously, like you said, sentenced to 10 years of possession of
Hmm.
marijuana. While he was away, like you said, he wrote tons of poems, and Ken and Sinclair were in constant communication through letters.
Hmm.
We have a
That's
clip
right.
of that poem, actually, and here's Ken reading that poem, one of the poems that was sent to him from Sinclair.
Each day I get farther behind in my work. So many possibilities, so little time to work them out. Even my weekends now shrink, smaller and smaller. And the weekdays, just enough time to answer letters, read the papers. Bah! My books scream at me from their shelf. My typewriter begs me to work. My mind is bursting with energy. 9.5 to 10 years will never be enough time.
And John Sinclair was a lot of things, of course. He was a poet, he was a musician, he
Hmm.
was the co founder of the White Panther Party. What did this moment mean for the alternative press's trajectory?
I think it meant a lot. There were a number of factors that sort of led to the alternative press expanding. So, first of all, Sinclair was one of the people that helped sell the alternative press's letterpress to the Mikolowskis
Wow.
that got it started because he had been part of the Detroit Artists Workshop, as we know. And when he was sentenced, he's was a huge figure at the time, and there was lots of national attention on him from others sort of in the counterculture and around the country and world too. And so when the alternative press was publishing his work while he was incarcerated, they were able to connect him with a wider community of poets and artists around the country that the alternative press was working with. And then Allen Ginsberg came to Detroit to help raise money for the John Sinclair Defense Fund. And he stayed with the Mikolowskis while he was in Detroit. And he raised a lot of money and he gave it all to Lenny Sinclair for the John Sinclair Defense Fund. But while he was in town, he also printed a poem with the Mikolowskis that was one of the first, I think, poems that helped then the alternative press kind of go more national in its scale. And this poem, Ken talks about how, it turned up then in these specialist book markets and bookstores around the country in New York, and they were selling the poem as this kind of rare Allen Ginsberg original, and the Mikolowskis had been giving it away for free. And so once that poem got out, lots more people began seeing, oh, well, this is really interesting work that this group in Detroit is doing, that this couple in Detroit is putting together, and we'd love to be involved with it. And it also brought more poets to Detroit from around the country who would come and stay with the Mikolowskis, and maybe they do a reading in the city because, of course, the Detroit Artists Workshop also had these Sunday poetry readings where poets would read and jazz musicians would play. And then some of these people stayed with the Mikolowskis, printed poems. Those went out to subscribers. And there was really this back and forth, this beautiful give and take between the poets who were kind of coming into the press and then sending word about the press out to their communities and other people who would eventually join and get involved as well.
Now, we talk about, of course, you've talked about the counterculture in which the alternative press lived and resided in, but it also moved within the musical frame as well, framework of the city of Detroit. I want to discuss some of the artists the alternative press work with, and the first is the rock band MC5. What kind of work did they do together?
Well, it was mainly through John Sinclair that the alternative press was connected to the MC5 because, in addition to all of his work as a journalist and a writer and an activist, he was also the manager of the MC5 for a time. And there were there weren't formal publishing relationship between the MC5 and the alternative press, but for instance, Ken once was invited up to read for the MC5, but actually between the Stooges and the MC5 playing at
Wow.
the Grandview Ballroom. And yeah, he tells this great story about some people in the crowd were sort of like, we don't want to hear any poetry, just bring on the MC5. But John Sinclair, he was like, no, we're going to listen to a revolutionary poet, we're going to definitely do this before we move on. And so you can see again that there's just this commitment, I think, to the importance of arts within culture as well as within political movements that you see that threads throughout all of these kinds of Detroit artists from the era. And I think it's really inspiring to see.
And we have that clip of Ken. He spoke with our producer, Carrie Jr. II, and told
Oh,
him
great.
a short story about one of those shows they used to do with MC5. Here's that clip.
We were both reading with the MC5 here at Wayne. And so I used to give readings at the Grandee Ballroom in between sets of Iggy and the Stooges and the MC5. Believe me, the energy drop from the music to the poetry was immense. Well, we were intermission. Everybody go out into the parking lot and smoke some dope, and that would leave almost nobody in the audience.
Oh,
Then the
I
poets
see.
would go up and say, "Now for my next poem, I want," and everybody, yeah, right. That was enough of that.
No.
We were at the intermission. In fact, one of the days I was there, Iggy, one of the days, he cut himself up and was starting to bleed on stage, and then he dove into the audience and spread his blood all around with everybody.
Wow.
He shared it with everyone.
Oh,
Then after that, I got to give my reading before the MC5 came out.
wow.
How do you follow that?
That
That's
whole story. I
amazing.
know. The whole story is hilarious. So, what do you think, Rebecca? What would you see a rock concert with poetry sprinkled in?
I mean, I would certainly go to it, but I'm predisposed to poetry. But I mean, you saw that too. I mean, for instance, like when the Detroit Artists Workshop was doing the Sunday poetry readings, they'd be doing poetry alongside, people like Sun Ra and Sonny Rollins. And so there was this mixing of poetry with music that, probably the music had a more commercial draw and maybe a larger audience than the poetry. But I think for the artists involved, it was all part and parcel with the wider kinds of practices in the arts that they were doing, and this confluence of inspiration that they took between music and the visual arts and the verbal arts, and all of it was working together toward a kind of common and I think at the time really beautiful collaboration that these artists had together.
When we think about the time frame in which the alternative press came to be, the late 60s through the 70s, what made Anne and Ken's work innovative?
Well, I say in the book that really there's no one else in the publishing world that was doing what they were doing at the scale that they were doing it. So there were some other small publishers that were also doing postcard poems, but no one did them consistently at the rate that they did them at for a span of 30 years, which is really remarkable. And they also have this series within the postcards called the Multiple Originals. And this involved the Mikolowskis printing up 500 blank postcards. So they'd be blank on the face, but on the reverse, it would say sort of an original poem by, whoever the poet was, and then the alternative press. And they would give these sets of 500 blank cards to poets who would then do unique works on the faces of these postcards, every single one different. So 500 separate poems, or oftentimes they weren't just verbal, they were generally a mix of verbal and visual strategies. So you'll see, people collaging, or there'll be a poem that's then painted on or drawn over or decorated in some way. Also, artists contributed. So there were photographers who were submitting works to this. There were illustrators that were doing original postcards, and painters too. And so
Hey, Rebecca,
now,
I'm
if
so
you
sorry.
have it,
I have to jump in because we're down to the wire
no
here.
worries.
And I know we had such a great conversation today. Don't want it to end, but it has to end. So, Rebecca, in 30 seconds or less, what is a lasting impact of the work of the alternative press? So, what can we identify today and say we have that because of Anne and Ken's work?
Lots of poets and artists who worked with the Mikolowskis to develop these original postcards that I was describing went on to write books based on the materials that they created with the Mikolowskis. So we have people like Joe Brainerd, Ted Berrigan, Alice Notley, Bill Berkson, Ed Dorn, all of these poets who went on to create work at a smaller scale, the short form style that the alternative press favored. And it brought and fed into their work all throughout the rest of their careers. So we see this in really concrete ways with these poets, but in general, I think that they influenced a huge swath of artists and poets from the late 20th century to do more experimental work in the short form.
Rebecca Kosick is an associate professor of comparative poetry and poetics at the University of Bristol. We are discussing her book, Dispatches from the Avant Garage, and the legacy of the Detroit-based publication, The Alternative Press. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro today.
Thank you so much. It's just been fabulous to be here.
You all stay right there. We'll be right back. This is the Metro.